Welcome to our channel, where history's forgotten shadows come back to life. Here we uncover the scandals, secrets, and untold tragedies that textbooks chose to hide. Today's story takes us deep into the twisted reign of a king whose name still stains the Spanish crown, a ruler whose private life was darker than his politics, and whose throne was built not only on power, but on fear and suffering. This is the story of Ferdinand VII, the Predator King. When historians debate the most disastrous rulers in Spain's past, one name always rises to the very top. Every serious scholar who has examined his reign ends up agreeing on the same thing. No king was more depraved, more vicious, or more disturbingly obsessed with twisted pleasures. Yet the story you think you know is only a polished illusion. Everything told about royal weddings, noble bloodlines, and the dignity of European crowns was carefully staged. Beneath that golden mask hid a far more grotesque truth. Ferdinand III did not merely govern Spain, he turned the royal palace into a theater of dark and perverse acts. Even the most hardened mistress of a brothel would have blushed at the scenes inside his court. Before people whispered his name as El Rey Felon, the felon king, he had been a prince, with a body twisted by nature. He was so incapable in the most basic duty of a husband that his own mother-in-law once wrote he could not even be called a man. This case remains one of the rare moments in European history when multiple witnesses left detailed testimonies. Royal doctors, foreign envoys, and even victims all described the same dreadful condition. It was a reality that influenced not only his marriage, but the fate of a nation. What you are about to hear will shatter every comfortable idea you hold about royal authority. It is at once the most pitiful and the most terrifying tale of physical dysfunction in monarchy's long history. So let us step back into a night in 1819, a wedding night so scandalous that it reached the ears of the Pope himself. October 1819, the royal palace in Madrid. A young princess, only 16, sits trembling in her wedding chamber. Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony had been raised in a convent, her innocence untouched. She still believed children were brought by storks. No one had explained to her what would happen on this night. Her German attendants, too embarrassed to speak plainly, dressed her in white and placed a rosary in her hands. Then the door creaked open. What entered was not a graceful prince from the pages of romance. It was a man of 35, swollen from gout, heavy in frame, with thick lips and the hungry eyes of a predator. But his face was not the true source of her terror. Ferdinand carried a condition so extreme that even today medical experts struggle to describe it. It was called macrogenitosomia, meaning his private parts were enormous, but in a deeply unnatural way. French writer Prosper Mérimée, who spoke to courtiers present that night, painted a chilling picture. Thin at the base, swelling at the end to the size of a clenched fist, and as long as a billiard cue. Imagine being a sheltered girl raised by nuns suddenly confronted with such a sight. The young queen took one glance, screamed, and fled from the bed in pure panic. The situation quickly worsened. Ferdinand, flushed with wine and desire, lurched after her. Picture this: an overweight middle-aged king stumbling after a terrified teenager. She ran fast, he did not. Enraged by her refusal, Ferdinand stormed out of the bedroom entirely naked, his deformity plain for all to see. He shouted at the queen's attendants, calling them brutes, and worse, demanding they prepare her for him in 15 minutes. These poor women, including her own sister-in-law, tried to explain to the frightened girl what was about to happen. Whatever they said only deepened her fear. When the king returned to claim his marital rights, he was met with a smell that even royal perfumes could not hide. In her terror, the young queen had lost control of herself. The bed was soiled, and the king recoiled in disgust. He sneered that queens did not smell like civet, then stormed away, refusing to touch her for more than a week. But for Maria Josefa, This was only the start of her ordeal. To understand why the night collapsed into disaster, we must uncover what Ferdinand hid beneath his royal robes. Be warned, this turns medically graphic. Several court physicians left explicit records of their examinations. Dr. José María de la Fuente wrote, "His Majesty possesses an organ of such unnatural size that normal relations would cause grave injury to his partner. It was not only the size, the very shape was like a cruel joke of nature. Thin at the start, swollen and massive at the end, it resembled a medieval instrument of torture more than a human feature. This was not a gift but a lifelong curse. It had haunted him since his first marriage when he was only 17. And if you think this wedding night was shocking, wait until you hear what happened on the very first one. In the early years of the 18th century, a young Prince Ferdinand was wed to his cousin, Maria Antonia of Naples. What happened on their first night together became the stuff of whispered court gossip. In Maria Antonia's own private letters, she described how the prince simply stood there, staring at her as if puzzled by her very presence. His hands moved awkwardly, clumsily, groping at her chest, unsure of what to do next. It was painfully clear the young man had no idea how the act between husband and wife was supposed to work. For not one night, not 1 month, but nearly an entire year, their marriage remained unconsummated. He would grow excited, attempt to approach her in bed, and then freeze, unable to continue. His strange, misshapen body turned the most natural of acts into a baffling, unsolvable problem. The Queen's mother, Maria Carolina of Naples, wrote letter after desperate letter to her allies. "My daughter cries herself to sleep each night," she wrote. "The prince feels nothing. No persuasion works. There is neither joy nor result. Whoever shares his bed is truly cursed." The situation became so hopeless that the royal confessor was summoned. A Catholic priest had to instruct the future king of Spain in humiliating detail on how to be with his wife. Word of this disgraceful lesson leaked into every royal court in Europe. The Spanish heir was mocked as a failure, a man whose body betrayed him incapable of fulfilling the most basic marital duty. When at last he managed the act, nearly 12 months after the wedding, the result was tragic. Maria Antonia suffered 2 miscarriages, most likely from internal injuries caused by his abnormality. At just 21, she died, her body broken by her husband's deformity. But the truly unsettling part came next. Once Ferdinand finally learned how to satisfy himself, he became consumed by it. The death of his first wife in 1806 freed him from the marital bed, but also unleashed the darkest side of his nature. The man who once could not perform became a ruler who could not stop. By 1814, after Napoleon's fall, Ferdinand had regained his crown. He was 30 years old, burning with frustration and giddy with absolute authority. What followed was a period of excess, so depraved it could rival the legends of Caligula. Almost every night, under a dark cloak, the king would slip out of the palace. His steps always led to the most infamous corners of Madrid's red light district. One den of vice became his favorite, a brothel owned by the notorious Pepa la Malagueña. The place was so scandalous that respectable citizens crossed the street rather than pass its doors. Ferdinand was rarely alone in these ventures. He gathered a band of young noblemen, each as corrupt and unprincipled as their king. Together they turned the city's most sordid streets into their personal playground. But what came next revealed something far more disturbing. Ferdinand, perversely proud of the deformity that once humiliated him, began treating it as a grotesque form of entertainment. Witnesses described the same revolting ritual. Drunk on cheap wine, the king would challenge his companions to measure themselves against him. Each man would expose himself, and comparisons would be made. Ferdinand always won. The group gave him a nickname, El Bien Dotado, the well-endowed one. The king strutted through brothels, his abnormality displayed without shame, boasting of his victories. Yet his pride in size was not the most chilling part of his habits. He had developed a fetish that revealed the depth of his corruption. Count José María de Villalobos recorded the king's own words. "They leave my bed, certain no other man can please them as I can. And what do I enjoy most afterward? Collecting the cloth marked with the proof of their first time." Yes, Ferdinand kept the blood-stained sheets of virgins he had taken. These were not relics of tradition, but tokens of a personal obsession. While his neglected second wife oversaw the creation of the Prado Museum, Ferdinand built his own vile collection. The prostitutes at Pipa's brothel were not his only victims. On his travels, he left a trail of broken women, a widow in Aragon, a young villager in Sassadon palace servants who could not defy their sovereign. Each encounter ended with another grim trophy added to his private chamber. And while the king indulged in this perverse hobby, his country crumbled. Spain lost its American territories. Thousands of liberal reformers were executed. The economy collapsed into ruin. But none of this touched Ferdinand's conscience. He had brothels to visit women to ruin and trophies to collect. This was the man who would take 3 more wives. 3 more women who would learn that life beside the King of Spain was a descent into a waking nightmare. In 1816, desperate for an heir, Ferdinand's solution was as shocking as his life. He chose to marry his own niece. Maria Isabel of Braganza was 19, plain in appearance, and Portuguese by birth. 3 strikes in the unforgiving eyes of the Spanish court. Her arrival in Madrid was met with a cruel rhyme, fea pobre, y portuguesa, ugly poor, and Portuguese. Maria Isabel possessed something her husband had never known: dignity. While Ferdinand prowled Madrid's brothels at night, she quietly worked to elevate the court. She founded the Prado Museum and opened the Royal Academy's doors to women artists. Culture was her weapon against the rot around her. But to Ferdinand, she was nothing more than a vessel to carry the heir he so desperately wanted. In 1818, she finally conceived. That pregnancy would turn Ferdinand's tale from grotesque farce into sheer horror. When the queen went into labor, the delivery went wrong from the start. The child was in a breech position, and Maria Isabel's strength was fading fast. The royal doctors faced an agonizing choice: save the mother or save the baby. Ferdinand did not hesitate. "Save the child," he ordered. "Cut her if you must." 12 witnesses later swore to the same events. The surgeons began an emergency cesarean in the year 1818. No anesthesia beyond strong drink and crude opiates. They cut into the queen's abdomen, believing she was senseless. She was not. Midway through Maria, Isabel's eyes flew open, and a scream tore through the palace halls. She was fully conscious as steel sliced into her womb. The doctors panicked, but bound by the king's order pressed on while she writhed in agony. The child was already lifeless dead for hours before the first incision. Maria Isabel bled out on the table, her final breath spent in unendurable pain, sacrificed for a child who would never live. She was 21 years old. Her sister publicly held Ferdinand responsible. Some at court whispered that his deformity had caused the complications. Others pointed to syphilis, his prize from countless brothel visits, as the cause of the stillbirth. Ferdinand felt no shame. Within a year, he was hunting for a 3rd wife. The heir was still his obsession. If Maria Isabel's death was a tragedy, what awaited wife number 3 was so obscene that even the Pope would intervene. Maria Josefa, the 16-year-old who had soiled herself on her wedding night, had only begun her nightmare. After that humiliating first night, Ferdinand left her untouched for a week. When he returned, she fought like a cornered animal. The convent-raised girl, who had been taught meekness, became a fury. She bit, scratched, and drove her foot into his grotesque anatomy hard enough to send the king limping out in pain. But she could not resist forever. Ferdinand was king, and in his eyes, Maria Josefa was property. He tried a new tactic, patience. Each night he entered her chamber. Each night she clutched her rosary and prayed while he tried to coax her. Her greatest shield was her ignorance. She truly believed babies came from storks. When Ferdinand tried to explain, she accused him of blasphemy. God would never design such a vile method to create life, she said. You are tempting me into sin with these lies. Weeks became months. The man who boasted of endless conquest could not claim his own wife. The whispers spread. Foreign envoys reported home that the King of Spain was being rejected by a teenage bride. At last, Ferdinand made a move as desperate as it was absurd. He appealed to the Pope. Pope Pius VII, an aging survivor of Napoleon's era, received a letter that must have tested his composure. The Catholic monarch of Spain was asking the Holy Father to persuade his wife to sleep with him. The Vatican's reply, still preserved in its archives, is a masterpiece of careful wording. The Pope explained that marital relations were not only allowed, but commanded by God. Producing an heir was her sacred obligation. To refuse her husband was to resist God's will. But even the Pope's urging did not immediately break her resolve. Maria Josefa agreed, but only if certain unusual conditions were met. Maria Josefa agreed to the marriage bed, but only under her own strange rules. Before each encounter, she would recite the entire rosary from start to finish. Her eyes remained shut the whole time, her mind fixed on the Virgin Mary to preserve what she called her spiritual purity. Picture it. You are the King of Spain, ruler over millions, master of life and death, and your teenage queen is whispering Hail Mary full of grace while you attempt to secure an heir. It was, by every account, the least passionate union in royal history. Maria Josefa lay still as marble lips moving in prayer, while Ferdinand, the same man who kept blood-stained trophies from virgins, now pleaded for any spark of interest from his own wife. For 10 long years, this was their reality. 10 years of lifeless, prayer-soaked attempts at intimacy. 10 years without a single child. When Maria Josefa died in 1829, at the age of 25, officially from fever, the court seemed almost relieved. Ferdinand had failed again. 3 wives, 2 dead. Not one legitimate heir. At 45, ravaged by decades of debauchery and disease, the king had one final chance. This time, he found a queen who matched him in cunning, if not in depravity. Maria Cristina of Bourbon II Sicilies was no naive bride. At 23, she was striking, intelligent, and shrewd, and in keeping with Bourbon tradition, also his niece. She knew exactly what she was walking into. Unlike her predecessor, she came armed with a plan. Maria Cristina understood that producing an heir was not just a matter of politics. It was a mechanical problem, one that demanded a practical solution. The answer came from an unlikely source, the royal physician, Dr. Antonio Hernandez. After examining the king and studying the grim medical history of his marriages, the doctor reached a blunt conclusion. The difficulty wasn't only size, it was physics. Think of planting a seed when the tool is too large for the garden. You can alter the garden or alter the tool. Since altering Ferdinand was impossible, the second option was off the table. So Hernandez devised something entirely new. He instructed the royal craftsman to create a silk cushion filled with the softest down. In its center was a perfectly measured circular opening exactly 4 centimeters deep. The design was simple. Ferdinand would pass through the opening, which would act as a barrier. It would allow only the necessary part to reach, preventing the internal injuries that had plagued his earlier wives. Maria Cristina presented it with the tact of a diplomat. She framed it not as a flaw in him, but as a medical safeguard for producing healthy heirs. The king's vanity, always his weak point, accepted the idea. Their first night using it was awkward. Ferdinand, long used to boasting of his size, now had to accept a limit. Maria Cristina treated it like any other royal duty, a procedure necessary for the crown's survival. And it worked. Within 3 months, she was pregnant. The court held its breath. Would this end in blood and death like all the others? On October 10, 1830, the cannons of Madrid roared in celebration. Queen Maria Cristina had delivered a healthy daughter, the future Isabella II. 2 years later, she bore another daughter, Luisa Fernanda. At last, Ferdinand had heirs. It had taken 4 wives, 2 deaths, 1 papal letter, and a custom-made cushion. But Isabella's birth created a new problem. Spanish law inherited from France forbade women from inheriting the throne. Ferdinand's brother Don Carlos fully expected to succeed him. Yet Ferdinand, who had gone to such extremes to create these daughters, would not let law or tradition rob them of the crown. In 1830, he issued the pragmatic sanction overturning centuries of precedent so Isabella could inherit. When Ferdinand died in 1833, his private life left one last scar on Spain, the Carlist War. A brutal civil conflict that killed hundreds of thousands, all sparked by a king who solved his problem with a pillow. But Ferdinand's darkness did not die with him. Maria Cristina quietly ordered an inventory of his private chambers. Hidden inside a cedar chest, wrapped in silk, were dozens of square cloths, each one neatly labeled with a date and a name. Carmen Peasant's house, March 1821. Isabella Palace servant, January 1823. Maria widow of Venice, September 1824. The king had never been lying about his trophies. For nearly 20 years, Ferdinand hoarded these macabre tokens. Each strip of cloth marked a woman some coerced, others deceived, who endured his unique cruelty. But the collection revealed something darker still. The dates formed patterns. After every political defeat, after every uprising crushed, after every execution, he ordered new trophies appeared in quick succession. Violence in the council chamber bled into violence in the royal bedchamber. The same hands that signed death warrants by day tore away innocence by night. To him, breaking political opponents and breaking women were 2 faces of the same twisted power. One entry chilled the investigators. Anna, 15 years. Daughter of Colonel Bermudez, February 1823. Colonel Bermudez had fought for the liberal constitution and lost. Anna had come to the palace to beg for her father's life. She left with her father executed, and her innocence destroyed, preserved in Ferdinand's vile archive. This was more than abuse for pleasure. It was calculated, systematic predation using sexual violation as a weapon of political terror. The liberals he could not hang. He humiliated through their daughters, their wives, their sisters. Maria Cristina ensured the full inventory never reached the public. She ordered the entire cash burned, showing more sense than her late husband ever had. But not before several witnesses recorded exactly what they saw. Their testimonies match in every detail too perfectly to dismiss as court gossip. We know the chest existed. We know he labeled each cloth. We know his collection grew after acts of political violence. What we will never know is the full scale. The surviving records suggest dozens of victims. The truth was almost certainly worse. Predators rarely keep a record of their failures. For every stained scrap, how many women fought him off? How many escaped? How many were silenced forever? Only Ferdinand knew, and he took those names to the grave. When Ferdinand VII died on September 29, 1833, Spain's grief was shallow. His own brother immediately rose in rebellion. His daughter would fight more than one civil war to keep the crown he had forced upon her. His widow married a palace guard within months, scandalizing the realm. Yet Ferdinand's most enduring legacy was not political, but personal. He turned the Spanish monarchy from a sacred institution into a sordid joke. Every king after him would carry that stain. Every royal marriage whispered about in suspicion. His daughter Isabella II inherited more than a throne. She inherited his appetite. Her own affairs and rumored nymphomania led to her overthrow in 1868. the Bourbon dynasty Ferdinand had engineered into existence was undone by its own inherited vice. And that silk cushion, the absurd device that allowed a deformed king to sire heirs, remains the perfect symbol of his reign. A monarchy so desperate it turned conception into a medical operation. A legitimacy so fragile it rested on a hole cut in silk. The cruelest irony. Ferdinand VII is remembered not for wisdom or victories, but for his grotesque anatomy and the trail of misery it caused. He longed to be El Deseado, the desired one. Instead, he became a warning, a living reminder that power without humanity breeds monsters. Historians agree. As Stanley G. Payne wrote, cowardly, selfish, grasping, suspicious, and vengeful. Or, as Emilio Lepara Lopez concluded, the very worst of the Habsburg and Bourbon kings. As the Duke of Wellington, his own contemporary, once said, the most contemptible of God's creatures. Harsh words, yet still too gentle. Ferdinand VII was not merely a bad ruler. He was a predator draped in velvet and gold. A man who wielded his deformity as a weapon. A monarch who collected human misery as if it were priceless art. And in the end, that became his true legacy. Not the crown passed to his daughter. Not the civil wars that bled Spain. Not even the infamous silk cushion that finally gave him an heir. His real legacy lies with the women whose names history never wrote down. The maids who could not refuse. The virgins reduced to trophies. The wives who lived in fear or died from his touch. Ferdinand proved that monsters do not always lurk under beds or in shadowed forests. Sometimes they sit upon thrones. Sometimes they are celebrated as kings. And sometimes, just sometimes, history has the courage to remember them exactly as they were. If this tale chilled you, there is another. You must hear the story of the medieval child bride, a 6-year-old forced to wed a 29-year-old king. A reminder that royal marriages have hidden more horrors than any battlefield. History is filled with kings and queens whose crowns hid far darker truths than their portraits ever showed. Ferdinand VII, then, was only one of them. If stories like this make you see the past in a new light, don't let them fade into silence. Like this video, so more people can uncover the truths history tried to bury. Share it, so others know that the monsters in our past didn't always hide in shadows. Sometimes they ruled empires. And subscribe. Because there are more hidden chapters, more untold scandals, and more dark secrets waiting for you here. The next story might be even darker than this one.